Sorry, an error occurred when sharing. What is going on? Why is this turning out to be a problem every single time?
Yeah, I think anytime your system gets updated, the sharing permissions seem to change for Chrome. I don't have this problem with anything else, but Chrome seems to be a...
Maybe it's the right thing from a security point of view. It's not letting me share. Maybe you can get started, Michael, while I figure out how to do the sharing.
I think after you enable sharing, then you have to restart, rejoin the meeting. But anyway, let's talk about ABN service. Okay. So just by way of introduction, Iter8 today is not supporting the newer versions of Iter8. The latest version does not support ABN testing. In order to support ABN testing, we're thinking about how to do this. So the typical challenge with ABN testing is that there's usually a front end where we define some business metrics. And that's the point of contact for the user, and that's where the business metric can be evaluated. But to support the business, there's typically also a backend service that gets used. And the backend service, we're going to look at the case where it's the backend service that is being updated, or where we have multiple versions. And the challenge is that this metric that we're computing at the front end needs to be associated with a particular backend candidate that's actually responsible for the metric that got calculated. So which backend got used? And this association, this problem of associating the request or the metric with a particular backend is the key challenge for ABN testing. And the approach we've taken in the past was kind of to rely on the user to figure this out and to produce metrics that made this association explicit. But we've identified that this is a key challenge for users, and instead we started thinking about how can we actually support users to do this. So let's look at sort of the elements of the solution. So the solution that we're proposing involves introducing what we're calling the Iter8 SDK. And the idea is that in writing the front end, we're asking users to use this Iter8 SDK as a means by which we can assist them in making this association of request or metric with a backend version.
So by the way, Michael, on this, are you also following the conversation with Yumo? He's actually interested in ABN testing in our Slack channel.
I did see this, yes.
Right. So I think when we have this ready, he said he's looking forward to, he or she, I don't know. The person said they are looking forward to the this new version. So I think we should get back to Yumo whenever this is available.
Yeah, I did try to reach out yesterday, but I haven't gotten a response yet. So.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So this front end, this SDK, the basic function that it provides is that when a user wishes to make a request to a backend service, the user should use the SDK and call a lookup function provided by the SDK. And the lookup function returns essentially a particular version of the backend that should be used. And the user should then proceed to communicate with that particular backend service, calculate metrics, and so on. And then Iter8 will also, the Iter8 SK will also provide a method to assist in writing the metric to a metrics database. And that function of assisting to write the metric enables us to assist the user in explicitly associating the generated metric with the version that was used in making the request. At this point, this really is something that the user could do on their own. They do know now the version. But rather than requiring them to not only learn the API, but to learn the content of the response in detail, we're providing this assistance in writing the metric. And secondly is not all users are writing these metrics today. And so providing the mechanism, we're enabling users to get started faster. Now, in doing its work of this SDK, of being able to provide sort of a lookup service for users to identify versions, this Iter8 SDK is relying on an Iter8, it says AutoX service, but Iter8 ABN service. And this ABN service, what it's doing is it's basically watching the resources of our cluster and identifying versions of an application, so that when it gets asked for an application, for a version of an application, it can respond with one of the versions that are available. And so it's gonna provide this service by basically watching the cluster and watching the resources and somehow identifying which versions are present and which versions are available for use. And so that's kind of the next thing we're going to look at is, what does it mean for, us to identify applications in a cluster? What does it mean to identify the versions? How will this Iter8 service, ABN service, do that? Any questions sort of at the high level here?
No questions so far.
All right. So I'm taking us through the issue that we have just briefly. Here's the approach we're going to use so that you can go back and comment on the issue if you like. So the ABN service is watching some set of Kubernetes objects in some set of namespaces. These are pre-configured in advance when the ABN service is launched. The assumption being that when we start the ABN service, the user knows what kinds of applications it's going to be running ABN tests on and what kinds of resources make up those applications. And what namespaces to watch. Now, the restriction to namespaces and resources is also partially about efficiency, but it's also partially about security. So we want to provide the ABN service with only the permissions to watch the set of resources that are of interest in the set of namespaces of interest and nothing else. And we want to sort of
Michael,
establish that up front as opposed to trying to dynamically establish these permissions at runtime.
So on that point, Michael, the advantage, one other advantage of doing this is usability, right? So you are enabling one special case, important special case you're enabling here is where that set of namespaces is, say, just one namespace. So what that means is that the user, very often the user has permissions to do stuff in a namespace code manner because namespace corresponds to admin boundaries. So what this means is that you can enable A/B testing even for these users who do not have cluster-wide privileges, but only have namespace scope privileges. That, I think, is important, right?
Yep.
And that includes, doing the Helm release of the ABN service itself within the namespace, because everything in that Helm chart is namespace scoped. If you only have one namespace, then everything will be namespace scoped. And and your application is namespace scoped, so everything can work very well, even if you just have permissions for a single namespace and nothing more as a user.
Yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. So the key question that I kind of raised earlier is, how does this service actually identify applications and identify versions of applications? And so there are some assumptions we're making. We're gonna start with the assumption that there is a label, app.kubernetes.io.name, on the resources that we're interested in. This is a standard and recommended label for identifying an application, and hence our choice in using it. So the Iter8 service, the ABN service, will essentially partition all of the resources it sees into a set of applications where it's defined by this label. And if something doesn't have this label, Iter8 will ignore it. The resources of a particular application are further subdivided or partitioned into versions using a label app.kubernetes.io/version. This is, again, a standard and recommended label, and hence the choice to use. Any objects, in an application without this label are considered to be a part of a default version. Now, being able to identify a set of applications and a set of versions doesn't really give us enough information yet, because the user, in doing a lookup, is interested in a version that is actually available or ready to respond to requests. And so we need to have a notion of when is a version ready. Just because the version is present doesn't mean it's ready. If I've created a deployment object, it may still be in the process of creating pods. So it may not be ready for use. And we don't want to provide a version to a user and have them send a request that will be rejected. To achieve this, we rely on an annotation. And we're going to rename this annotation Iter8.tools ready. Sorry about that. Iter8 tools ready. And when this annotation has a value of true, then we will interpret that to mean that the entire version is ready. So while this is an annotation on one object, it does not mean that that object is ready. It means that the entire version is ready. And so the expectation here, or the assumption, is that the user, after deploying a version, will go and annotate one object with this annotation. We are assuming it's just one object. If the user annotates multiple objects, behavior is undefined. In particular, in the sense if they're annotated with different values, behavior may be interpreted as either ready or not ready, just depending on which was last seen. So these are initial approaches for readiness, and this assumption allows us then to identify the versions and identify which ones are ready and be able to respond to a lookup request. So this issue has more information about how this might be installed using Helm, how to configure the set of resources and the set of namespaces. And then it adds some additional details about what this lookup call might look like. It is described here in the issue, and I encourage you to look at it. I'm not going to go through it in detail today. Using a gRPC service. So the intent is, by providing it in gRPC, we are able to enable a large number of users writing front-end services in multiple languages to make use of the service, and therefore to make use of the Iter8 ABN testing framework. And I think that's all I have for now. Are there any questions?
No.
And if you like, I can show you a running version of the service. We can add applications and watch it identify them and identify versions and identify readiness, if you like.
Sure. Why not?
Why not?
All right. Okay. So here we're running on the left our ABN service, and there's nothing that's defined.
You're not sharing. You're not sharing.
Am I sharing now?
Yeah.
Okay. On the left, we're running the service. What it's going to do is it's every time it sees some change in the environment, it's going to print out on the right a list of applications. On the left, a list of applications, a list of versions, and whether they're ready or not. Right now, there's nothing there. I'm going to start an application. I'm going to actually start 2 versions of the application at once. It's a very simple deployment defined application. So it has the label, one of them has a name, it actually doesn't have a version, which means it's going to be identified as a default version. And the second one is, again, part of the same application, but it has an explicit version defined. Neither of these has an annotation indicating that it's ready. So let's go ahead. And deploy these. So we're creating the 2 deployments, and each time a change was observed, we sort of printed out what was there. But so we just need to look at sort of the last list. So currently it says that the curl application is present, and there are 2 versions. There's a default version and there's a version v2, and it's actually listing the resources by name. It's not telling you what kind of resources it is, but it's listing the name, the namespace and name of each of the resources in that version. Let's go ahead and annotate the version v2 resource as being ready. So we're going to set the annotation iterate tools ready to true. And when we've annotated it, the service has recognized the change, and it has identified that version v2 is now ready. And so upon lookup, and we don't have a lookup function implemented yet, upon lookup, this v2 would be returned as a possible version. I can do anything else you like here if you want me to try different things.
So one thing, Michael, this kind of prompts the question. The app Kubernetes IO labels are actually recommended labels by Kubernetes.
Yes.
Now, I think what we are saying, though, is that the moment you start using ABN service, they become required labels. At least the app Kubernetes IO name is a required label. Because what are we doing? The front end is using ABN service to get the version name, and it will fail if the
name label is not there.
Yeah, name label is not there. So I think, of course, you still have defaults and fail-safe front-end behavior. You have that catch-all in the front end. If there are errors, you can do stuff, but you're really messing up everything at that stage. So yes. I think first of all, the labels do seem required. Second, perhaps it would be okay for us to say the version label also is required, even for the default version. So this way, we kind of force the user to this is interesting. So the question is, what happens if you don't see any ready anywhere? What is the ABN service expected to do if you don't see any ready anywhere? And is that a valid question? First of all, are we saying to the user something that anyway they shouldn't be doing?
So I don't know the answer to this question. From one perspective, the answer is, yeah, it's required. Let's just tell the user they have to have it. From another perspective, we could argue that we actually want users to write code using this API, and whether or not they're doing testing, frankly. Because it will enable them to test. And so how can we write it in a way that would allow them to do this? And furthermore, to do it in a way that enables them to start using it now and start testing later. So can we provide it in a way that enables them to continue using their system and gradually move to testing without sort of shutting everything down or relabeling everything all at once kind of statement? So that would be the other strategy, which is how do we do this in a way that's a very gentle introduction to the user that doesn't break things as it's introduced? And I think the answer is different in each of these two cases. So in the first case, you're saying, yeah, just relabel things and it'll work. Otherwise, it's just going to stop. The second approach would say, so we want to have a situation where there is a default if there are no version labels. That we would expect, perhaps even in the default case, that user requests would be sent to the default version even if there is no ready label. That if it's labeled as if it's a default, it's without, and in particular if it doesn't have a label, it's because it's kind of is being grandfathered in, as it were. That would be another strategy. I don't know the answer here. Certainly it's easier if we just assume there are labels present. It's not hard to allow for a default. It's not hard to even allow the user to configure which label to look for. So we could allow them to use a different label for application and a different label for version. And that's not hard to change also. It's just the label we're looking for. I don't know the best answers here. This is really a statement of, I think we're trying to choose something reasonable as a starting point and seek feedback from users. Is it too hard to get started? Does it introduce too many problems? Is it great?
Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I feel that the version is really, we should not call it default versus candidate. So I don't think that's the version label, because the way Kubernetes recommends it, it is some sort of a unique identifier for each version of your code, and that could be something like the Git commit label, out of which, for example, that code was created or that model was created or something like that. So first of all, there is some uniqueness associated with each version, and that's what they recommended, Kubernetes recommended definition of version is. And I think we should keep that. And it looks like we also have a different label here, which we can feel free to call it what we want. But I've seen the word track in some examples, app.kubernetes.io/track, or it can be iterate.tools/track, whichever we want, and probably iterate.tools/track, because that is not recommended by Kubernetes, it is recommended by us. So iterate.tools/track, and that can be default or candidate. So I think we can safely say you annotate your applications this way. So app.kubernetes.io, app.kubernetes.io name, version, and iterate.tools track. And track can be default track or candidate track. And there can be multiple candidates. It's okay because they will be distinguished, disambiguated using version names. But at least this lets us retain the intended recommendation for the version label.
So I don't understand the need to introduce track.
To distinguish between
I think
default
you're arguing that perhaps the use of the version doesn't correspond to a user's version. And I think that's exactly the intent of the recommended label. They're just telling users, you know, it needs to correspond to something reasonable. They're not defining that it be a Git label or anything else. They're saying it needs to be unique for versions.
Yes, but when you call it default or candidate, it is not unique for versions.
I am not calling it default. I am not calling it candidate. I am not calling it anything.
So if the user decides to label every version that they are supplying, how will you know which is default and which is candidate? And they decide to do it uniquely as recommended by Kubernetes.
So this is a problem that we're having for, so we're introducing a problem here. We're correctly identifying versions, which is what the intent here is. What we're asking is, how do we go a step further and actually create an experiment out of it? And when we create an experiment, we need to know which is a candidate and which is a default version, an original or default version, and which is a candidate version.
Yes.
That's a separate problem.
But we used the version to solve that problem because your description says, if you do not specify a version label, you will consider it as a default version. And I'm saying, what if the user gives every version a unique label?
When I use the word default, I do not mean a default version in the sense of running an experiment. I just mean that it is like a default namespace. It is a default. It is an unassigned version. I could call it that. So I use the word default in the sense that if it doesn't have a label, I'm going to consider it as part of the same version. You know, the pieces that don't have labels, the resources that don't have labels, are all part of the same version. Whether the word default is the right word here or not, I don't know. But the word default does not mean that in an experiment it is the default version. It just means it's an unlabeled version.
So given that there is a default version in an experiment, right? Because
yes,
you do have to have that notion. I feel you do have to have that notion in ABN. I think it makes sense for us to, first of all, insist. It's a simple thing. We insist that everybody has a version. If it doesn't, just like you're going to ignore resources that don't have a name on it, same way you can just say I'm going to ignore resources that don't have version on it. So if you want it to participate in anything ABN related, put a proper version on it. That's all. So, and I think we can also insist on calling it default or candidate. Do you want to treat this as a candidate version, or do you want to treat this as a default version? And if you start seeing, you know, two different resources with the same, you know, both calling themselves default, and well, with the different versions and version conflicts and things like that, you can just, you know, say there's an error. This is not this. You can always say this is the right configuration, and this is how we expect you to annotate things. And if you refuse to annotate things this way, then we will just consider it an error. From an A/B testing perspective, it will be an error and flagged as such, and you will run issues.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So, in ABN testing, do we really need the notion of a default and candidate version?
Yes. In your implementation, you do need a default candidate version, because what if you don't see ready anywhere? You still have to supply some response. Remember, every routing call
Yes.
goes through ABN. So you need to be able to answer the routing call.
Yes, so I actually have not shown that as a part of the API that the user. Is this the right thing? As a part of the lookup request, we actually expect the user to identify the version that it would like to send requests to as a default that will be used if the backend is unable to identify any other version. So the idea here being that it's really up to the user what they mean by default.
So that version there is a version label.
It is.
That means each time the backend version label changes, the user has to change the front-end code. There are non-trivial implications for those recommendations. That's what I'm trying to say. Once you agree with what Kubernetes calls version, uniquely identify versions, then you need a way to make sure. You also definitely don't want, you want the invariant that, every time the backend changes, you don't have to change the front-end code. That is definitely an invariant that we want, property that we want to satisfy.
We also talked about the implementation of the communication from the front end to the back end. And we said, we're not going to make any assumptions that when we identify a version, we're not even going to give the user any information about how to communicate to that version.
Right.
Which means that given a version name, the user has to know how to communicate to that backend.
Sure. You don't have to, then that's a good point. So you don't just give them a version name. You also give them a track. That's what the track is meant for. So you tell them whether it's a default track or candidate track. Let's take A/B testing.
So I understand. I think I understand the argument here and the purpose for this track. I'm trying to. It's not here. This was in the original, proposals that you had written. The use of track, and I explicitly ignored it or didn't include it because I'm trying to take advantage of the recommended labels that already exist. I don't want to introduce a new label if we don't have to introduce a new label.
Yes, but the recommended labels have a particular recommendation that the version name uniquely identify a version.
Which is fine.
But that alone is not going to help the front end. The front end code cannot be invariant if that is the only thing that you're supplying. Because as you rightly pointed out, I have to change each time version changes, I have to change my mapping.
Well, that doesn't mean you're right at changing code. It means you're looking up something different.
Which has to be changed.
Which had to be changed, but may have to be changed anyway. I mean, it's being changed in either case.
That's what I'm saying. It doesn't have to be. If you supply the track. If you supply the track.
If you're supplying a track, what does track mean?
Track is the key that the front end uses for mapping from the track to the routing information.
So the routing information is changing.
I'm saying that doesn't change. It doesn't have to change.
The mapping may not change, but the actual routing information is changing.
Not for the front end. The front end requires the URL of the service to which to send the request. And I'm saying that doesn't have to change. If you have default in the track, I send the request to default.hello.spc.cluster.local. If you have candidate, I have another service called candidate service, and I'm sending my traffic to candidate.hello. Hello being the namespace, svc.cluster.local. So here is a solution which does not require the front-end team to keep changing their code each time the back-end team changes their code. This was the basic reason, right, for structuring the SDKs the way it was structured. We do want that decoupling. We don't want the front end to have to react each time the backend team decides to, put out a new version, because that is really an inhibitor to adoption. You're forcing different teams to move in lockstep. That may not be. It's not needed. There is a simple way to get around it. We can decouple them.
I think then we don't need the version label at all.
I think
we can ignore the version label.
The version label, I think, is useful for metrics. You still want to uniquely associate metrics with versions. I would keep both. I would just keep, whatever labels and annotations I'm associating with a particular version. In this case, the experiment, it was, for example, let's take an example, right? So there was a version V2, and that V2 is unique, or V37 if you prefer. V37 is unique. Next time you make a new version, it's going to be V38, but V37 is unique. But its track changed. It used to be candidate, now it is default. You can continue to associate metrics with V37, and you can continue to do the analysis using all of the metrics collected for V37. So that is still useful in analysis. You uniquely identify metrics with versions, and you uniquely identify routes with tracks. In this way, you get the best of both worlds.
We are requiring users not to update routing information, but to update the tracks on all their objects.
That's what the backend team does. So when you are a backend team, and when you are changing or rolling out a new backend, or rolling out a new candidate, rolling out a new deployment, yes, of course you have to change certain labels. No questions there. But it sort of, you wash the hands off of it if you're a front-end team. I can focus on providing the front-end experience without having to worry about the backend. And usually the front-end code has many, many other things going on. This backend is not my only headache in the front-end component. I would like to do it once, do it right, and forget about it. And, do A/B test forever using this front-end code. And it's now the backend team. Each time, of course, each time they release a new version, they are doing something. They are putting out some objects, right? So there's definitely some work involved for the backend team. Each time they are putting out a new version. By that, I mean their CI or CD may be doing it. Of course, they may not be doing it manually, but some backend component is doing some work each time a new version comes out. It's exactly the same. In addition to what the normal work that you do, we are telling you, put labels and put some discipline around how you use the labels. If you use labels in this particular way, it will enable your front-end teams to A/B test it this way. That's all that we are saying.
I feel like we're introducing a requirement that the backend be able to atomically change all the labels from default to something else and from candidate to default at once.
I didn't say anything about atomicity, but
I think it's implied though.
Perhaps I didn't understand the question.
If I've decided I want to replace default with candidate, I have to relabel or re-annotate everything.
No.
Or redeploy them.
No. No. That's usually not how it works, right? What do people do today is, let's say they have two versions. It may be as simple as changing the image in the current default version. So I have a candidate with image, my app :v2, and in my default, I have my app :v1. So when I want to upgrade to v2, I make the corresponding changes in the default version. This is how it works today. And after that, of course, you don't want to keep splitting traffic between a default and a candidate. So you have an option. Here, all you need to do is take out the ready label from the candidate, and boom, the traffic will stop going to the candidate. It will go to the default. That's all is needed. But there are other ways to do this. You can take out the ready label, and after a while, waiting for a few minutes, just delete the candidate also. If you're thinking, it's consuming resources, you want to do garbage collection, whatever it is that you want to do your cleanup, whichever way you want to do the cleanup, you remove all traces of the candidate. But typically, the way it's just an upgrade. How would you upgrade your default object?
Well, you're relying on the Kubernetes upgrade to do it for you, and you're relying on readiness checks to be there. Okay.
For the upgrade, we are not providing anything. You're just saying when you're ready to upgrade your default version exactly the same way you would have upgraded it without Iter8. That's what you're saying. But since you are in the Iter8 A/B testing frame of mind, we expect you to have certain labels. That's all that we are, and annotations. That is all that we are insisting on. So make sure they are there as part of your upgrade and as part of every release. But you do whatever you normally do. Without Iter8, what would you have done to go to the next version, default version? Do the same thing. That's all we're saying.
All right.
I don't think that story is complicated, by the way. That story is the part where we say you don't have to learn anything new for upgrade and for rollout. You do your upgrade and rollout the way you would normally do it. That's all. Where we come in is in evaluation, and to begin with, we will probably do static traffic splitting, but over time we will do bandit algorithms, more dynamic traffic shifting. We can do all those things. We can play that game here with the SDK also. But to begin with, we'll keep it simple, just some sort of a randomized split for users, different users, something like that.
Okay. I'll look at the design, updating the design.
Yep. The other aspect here of the design is stickiness, right? I think we will want stickiness from the get-go. This is not a concern if you're doing any other A/B testing or mirroring and all those things. None of these experiments have a stickiness issue. You just do you. I mean, whatever way the traffic flows, it flows. But for AB or ABN, I think you will want from the get-go for the SDK to support stickiness, because you will want to associate a user in an unambiguous and clear way with a particular version. And that's probably, I think, how users, that would be the expectation. I don't think random traffic splitting is going to cut it. I think random user splitting is what you're going to need. And how you identify a user is up to you, really. It can be header-based, it can be cookie-based. There are many ways to identify a user. But I think we need some way to, associate users. We have a concept of transaction, right? So I think somehow user identity has to play into that. We have to, flesh out that part of the design also. These are, things that came out of the previous A/B testing experience, right? With the CRD model, with the 0.7 model. So this is not anything new, but A/B testing doesn't make sense without that stickiness part. At least to me, it doesn't make any sense. Because if you have multiple transactions associated with the user going to different versions, how do you associate any consistently? You cannot associate the metric value with a particular version. So some intelligence is needed, or some hints are needed for associating users with versions.
Okay.
Good. This is non-trivial. I think this is a non-trivial design. I don't think this part is easy, but we can definitely do.
That's why we're talking about it. We're getting the feedback, identifying the gaps.
Yeah, it's not at all simple. So, and when we leave all this without an SDK to the end user to figure out, we really, the end user, that's why it hasn't taken off, right? This backend A/B testing is not a thing in Kubernetes because it's not easy. They don't have that support. All right, so I will attempt sharing with this new browser.
I've eaten up all your time.
Yeah, it's okay.
You only have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Are you able to see anything?
Yes.
It's starting. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just make it brief. We have gone through this AutoX before. So you install the AutoX controller this way, and then you this is how you install the AutoX controller. And essentially, as part of the controller configuration, you decide what experiment groups there are and what resources you're watching and when to automatically launch experiments. Right? We did this conversation before, and this example hasn't really changed much. But I think, Michael, you made a comment earlier. Should there be a single namespace or should there be multiple namespaces? I am coming to the conclusion that we can just keep it simple and make it a single namespace. I do not see a reason to complicate it. And if you have similar experiments in multiple namespaces, just make them different groups and just supply those supply that information through multiple groups. Maybe you can have hello minus default as one group, hello minus ns1 as another group. You can you can use your imagination to configure the groups, but I think that's okay. It's a valid thing. So we can make it one namespace. That's number one. And there is, I think, a second complexity here. And let's go through that complexity.
So you're watching a resource type. And the idea here is to identify when new ones are present to run an experiment.
Let's take load testing. So I'm watching resource types. And I'm going to react. Let's not say I'm going to launch an experiment. I'm going to react each time I detect a new resource. And if I see certain annotations in them, then I am going to launch the experiment.
So do we want to, so this is an easy way to do this, and it enables experimenting very quickly. I'm wondering about the relationship with the ABN service, which isn't just watching resources, but essentially watching versions.
Yeah.
And in principle, we could react to a new version by running an experiment. But it's not the same as reacting to a new resource. It's adding assumptions about labels and a bunch of other things to enable recognizing versions.
I hear you. I hear you. At least to begin with, I would keep them separate. AVN, we can keep it separate, and AutoX, we can keep it as a way to launch mirroring and load testing experiments to begin with. I think there is a use case of combining ABN with AutoX, but I don't even know what that AutoX, or even without AutoX, Iter8 experiment need to look like for that ABN. We are still not there yet. But we can come back to that question when we have a big. We can go very far without a notion of an experiment in ABN, right? So you already are enabling routing, and you're already enabling metrics collection. So we can do a little bit more and report these findings. We can just start there for ABN, and to do an experiment on top of it, I think is the next step. But there has to be a clear use case for that, right? Here's what you can do with an experiment that you wouldn't just be able to do with the SDK that we are providing you. It's insufficient to do it. But with the concept of an experiment tagged on top of it, there is something more you can get out of it. For example, notifications after a certain number of iterations is one example, but there possibly could be other. It's no rollout support, whatever. So I think those are all possibilities. But for now, I think we can go far without having to complicate the ABN service with the notion of experiment, or without having to complicate the AutoX service with the ABN part to it. In both mirroring and load testing, I think it's just a resource. A single resource get updated and you do your thing each time. I think that's how we can easily frame it in both cases. But for ABN, I think it's a question mark. How these two things, if they come together, how they come together is still a question mark. All right, so how many minutes do we have left?
2.
I can quickly say one minor thing, which is I think we will want to revisit RBACs, because the way Iter8 experiments, Kubernetes experiments support RBACs right now is each experiment re-uploads the RBAC and recreates the RBAC. I don't think we will want that for AutoX. So something needs to change in the current RBAC setup so that you can launch it once and do it once, and then you don't have to worry about it again. So that's just a side effect of attempting this AutoX, but something we can look into.